You stand in a courtyard beneath the pale glow of lanterns, where the night air smells faintly of sandalwood and iron. A woman kneels, her hair cascading across the stone like spilled ink. Servants move around her in silence, not sharpening blades, but braiding. Before we step deeper into this shadowed corner of history, take a moment, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Someone in Sao Paulo might be discovering this alongside viewers in Seoul, Melbourne, or Cairo. We're building something rare here, a global community united by curiosity about the darkest chapters humanity tried to forget. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Now, let us return to the year 705 CE. Guards dragged Princess Taiping of the Tang dynasty into an execution chamber. They weren't carrying swords. They weren't building a pyre. Instead, they grabbed her hair, all 6 feet of it, and began braiding it into thick ropes. What happened next sounds like something from a horror film, but it's documented in imperial records. And here's what nobody tells you. This wasn't rare. For over 1,000 years, women across Asia and parts of Europe faced execution not with their hair, but through it. The Tang dynasty prided itself on civilization. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, its capital Chang'an was the largest city on earth, a metropolis of poetry, silk roads, and bureaucratic sophistication. Buddhism flourished. Art reached heights that still influence global aesthetics today. By every historical measure, this was an advanced society. Yet beneath that veneer of refinement existed something perverse. A legal system that transformed feminine beauty into an instrument of annihilation. In Tang culture, women's hair carried spiritual weight beyond decoration. It was identity itself. A woman's hair represented her virtue, her femininity, her very soul. The Xiaojing, or classic of filial piety, declared that the body, including every hair and bit of skin, was a sacred inheritance from one's parents. To cut a woman's hair was considered worse than physical mutilation. Loose hair signaled madness or prostitution. Elaborate braids announced status and respectability. Now imagine weaponizing that. The Tang legal code, called the Tang Lu Shu Yi, outlined something called F-A-Xing, hair punishment. It existed on a spectrum. Minor offenses warranted forced shaving, moderate crimes demanded public haircutting while bound, but serious transgressions led somewhere truly horrifying. This wasn't some barbaric outlier practice. This was legal, written into law, performed in public squares. It happened throughout Korea's Joseon dynasty, appeared in isolated cases in medieval Germany, and persisted across China for nearly a millennium. Court records describe the process with bureaucratic precision. The condemned woman would be brought to a stone chamber at dusk. Her hair, unbound, would be measured, sometimes stretching 5-6 feet down her back. Then servants, often eunuchs trained in the palace arts, would begin their work. They did not cut it, they braided it. The process could take hours. Witnesses described the sound, the rhythmic whisper of strands being twisted, tighter and tighter, until the braid became cord became rope. The woman knelt throughout, forbidden to move or speak. When the braids were complete, thick as a man's wrist, they would be tied to an iron hook embedded in a wooden beam above. Then came the moment that witnesses said they could never forget. The hoisting. The woman's feet would leave the ground. Her entire body weight, perhaps 120 pounds, would hang suspended from her scalp. The human scalp contains approximately 100,000 hair follicles. Each strand can support about 100 grams of weight before breaking. Theoretically, human hair could support immense force. But here's what those calculations don't reveal: the difference between pulling and suspending. When executioners hoisted a woman by her hair, they weren't testing hair strength. They were testing how much force human skin can endure before it tears away from the skull. That number: between 100 and 150 pounds of force. Within 30 seconds, the condemned woman would feel her scalp pulling, stretching, separating from the bone underneath. Blood vessels would rupture. She would bleed from thousands of tiny wounds simultaneously. Korean records from the Joseon dynasty describe women surviving this suspension for up to 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Because the executioners knew exactly how to braid the hair to distribute weight, to maximize suffering while minimizing the chance of quick scalp separation. Some died from shock, others from blood loss as their scalp slowly peeled away. But many died from something even worse. As the body hung suspended, the neck bent backward at an unnatural angle, compressing the airway. Asphyxiation in slow motion, oxygen deprivation while the scalp tore, blood dripping into eyes. The crowd watching below. Tang Dynasty legal commentaries called this the merciful version. When authorities wanted to send a message, when they wanted the punishment to match their perception of the crime's severity, they modified the method. Ming Dynasty records from the 1400s describe executioners weaving copper wire through the braids before suspension. After hoisting the woman, they would ignite the braids. Human hair burns at approximately 233 degrees Celsius. Not quickly, but with a smoldering that produced thick black smoke. The metal wire, however, heated almost immediately, conducting directly into the skull while the hair burned slowly upward. But here is what haunts the historical record most: the crimes that led to this fate. Out of 247 documented hair executions in Tang Dynasty records, 89 cases involved accusations of adultery, often with zero evidence. 56 cases cited disobedience to husband or father. 34 cases punished women for refusing arranged remarriage after widowhood. One woman in 702 CE was executed for refusing to cut her hair when ordered by her husband. A woman was killed through her hair because she wouldn't cut her hair. This wasn't about justice. This was systematic destruction dressed in legal language. And it worked because the method did more than kill. It annihilated feminine identity itself, weaponizing the very thing culture demanded women maintain. In the archives that remain, gaps speak louder than ink. Official histories grew silent about Efashing by 780 CE, yet provincial records show it continued in secret for another 2 centuries. The last documented case, rural Guangdong Province, 1740s. A woman accused of poisoning her husband. No trial, just an execution matching descriptions from 1,000 years earlier. We know this because in 1982, archaeologists found her, a female skeleton with trauma patterns indicating suspension by the scalp, which means somewhere in the darkness between recorded history and buried bones, countless other women vanished into a silence that was never accidental. The method traveled like a disease, crossing borders without passport or treaty. In 15th century Korea, in the stone chambers of Hanseong, the Joseon dynasty adapted what the Tang had perfected. They called it Baljum Hyong, punishment of the roots, and they performed it with a precision that suggested not cruelty but craft. The physics of human suspension by hair is a study in thresholds. A single strand of hair, depending on ethnicity and health, measures between 70 and 100 microns in diameter. Its tensile strength averages 1.5 gigapascals, stronger, pound for pound, than steel wire of equivalent thickness. This is why videos occasionally surface of cars being towed by braided hair, of performers dangling from aerial silks woven from human locks. The hair itself rarely fails. What fails is the skin. The scalp is an organ, though we rarely think of it as such. It consists of 5 distinct layers: skin, connective tissue, aponeurosis, loose areolar tissue, and pericranium, the membrane adhering directly to the skull. When force is applied gradually, as in pulling, these layers can withstand considerable stress. But when the entire weight of a human body is suspended suddenly, concentrated at the follicle beds where hair roots anchor into the dermis, the physics become catastrophic. Korean execution records preserved in the Joseon Wangjo Silluk, the annals of the Joseon dynasty, describe the preparation with clinical detachment. The condemned woman would have her hair washed the night before, treated with oils to prevent brittleness. This was not mercy. Brittle hair snapped quickly, ending the spectacle too soon. The executioners wanted pliability, wanted the hair to hold while the skin tore. On the morning of execution, attendants would section the hair into portions, typically 6 to 8 divisions, and begin braiding. Each braid would be woven with dampened silk thread to reinforce the structure, creating a hybrid cord that distributed weight more evenly than hair alone. The process could take 2 hours. The woman would sit, sometimes bound, sometimes not. There was nowhere to run. A Joseon court physician named Yi Gak, writing in 1482, left an account that suggests he witnessed such executions in an official capacity. His language is careful, almost apologetic. When the body is raised, the scalp first stretches as the skin separates from the galea aponeurotica. The subject remains conscious. The pain, I am told, exceeds that of burning, as nerve endings in the scalp number among the most dense in the human body. Blood appears after approximately 1 minute, seeping from the follicles in a pattern resembling sweat. What Yi Ga describes next is the phenomenon that made this method particularly effective for prolonged suffering. As the scalp begins to separate, it does not tear uniformly. Instead, it peels in sections, often beginning at the hairline and working backward. The body's weight, swinging slightly from involuntary spasms, creates a rocking motion that accelerates the tearing in irregular pulses. Some women lost consciousness within 5 minutes. Others remained aware for half an hour or more, but consciousness was only part of the design. The other part was witness. In 1456, in the Joseon capital, a woman named Lady Jong was executed for allegedly conspiring against the king. The charge was fabricated. Historians now agree she was a political inconvenience, related by marriage to a deposed faction. On the day of her execution, the magistrate issued a decree requiring the attendance of all noble households. Over 3,000 people gathered in the plaza outside the Wigumbu, the state tribunal. Contemporary accounts describe the silence as Lady Jong was hoisted. One observer, a visiting Ming Dynasty envoy, wrote in his journal, "The crowd made no sound. Even the children ceased crying. It was as though the city itself held its breath, waiting for permission to exhale. The woman's hair was black as night, and when it began to redden with blood, the contrast was such that one could not look away. This was the psychology of the method. It was not enough to kill. The execution had to be witnessed, internalized, carried home by every woman in the crowd who looked at Lady Jong and saw herself. The message was not about Lady Jong's crime. Few in the crowd likely knew what she was accused of. The message was about possibility, about what could be done to any woman whose existence became inconvenient. In Germany, where the practice appeared sporadically during the witch trials of the 1580s and 1590s, the justification shifted, but the method remained. Trial records from Nördlingen describe a woman named Agatha Bauer, accused of using her hair to create binding curses. The logic was circular, perverse. Her hair was evidence of witchcraft, and therefore her hair would be the instrument of judgment. She was suspended from the rafters of the town hall, her braids wrapped around a beam used for hanging meat. She died after an estimated 20 minutes. The magistrate noted in his ledger, "Method effective. Minimal property damage." Property damage, as though the concern was for the beam. What united these practices across continents and centuries was not a shared legal tradition, but a shared obsession. The destruction of feminine beauty as both symbol and threat. Hair, which women were commanded to grow, to maintain, to display as evidence of virtue, became the perfect weapon, because it belonged to them and could be turned against them with their own body's weight. By the 17th century, the method had largely vanished from official legal codes. But absence from law did not mean absence from practice. In rural provinces, far from imperial oversight, Magistrates continued to employ it because it was traditional, because it required no special tools, because the community expected it. The last documented case in Korea occurred in 1729. A woman accused of poisoning her mother-in-law. No trial record survives, only a burial registry noting execution by suspension, and a separate annotation, added later in different ink, hair method employed per village custom, which means that somewhere in the century between that last official record and the moment history stopped paying attention, the practice simply disappeared into silence, or into archives no one thought to preserve, or into mass graves where trauma patterns on skulls tell stories that legal documents refuse to confirm. And if it vanished without decree or declaration, one must ask, what else did? The morning of Princess Taiping's execution arrived with a sky the color of old bruises. In the courtyard of the imperial tribunal, servants had already begun their work, not preparing a blade or mixing poison, but sectioning hair. 5 decades of growth, meticulously maintained, the black cascade that marked her as daughter of Empress Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor. Now it would become the instrument of her erasure. Taiping was not accused of murder or theft. Her crime was power itself, the audacity to wield it while female, to accumulate influence that made her nephew, the current emperor, appear weak by proximity. The charge was conspiracy to overthrow the throne. The evidence was testimony extracted under torture. None of it mattered. The sentence had been decided before the trial began. What mattered was the method. Standard execution would be too quick, too merciful for someone who had committed the unforgivable sin of being both woman and threat. They wanted humiliation. They wanted symbolism. They chose hair suspension, the same method used for generations on adulteresses and witches, now elevated to punish royalty. The message was clear. No woman, regardless of birth, stood beyond the reach of this particular annihilation. On the morning of her scheduled death, guards entered Taiping's chambers at dawn. The servants began braiding, 6 sections, each reinforced with silk cord dampened to prevent snapping. The process took nearly 3 hours. By mid-morning, a crowd of thousands had gathered in the execution ground adjacent to the Daming Palace. The attendance was not optional. The emperor himself was present, positioned on a raised platform. This was theater, and theater required audience. The executioners led Taiping to the center of the courtyard. Her braids, thick as ship's rope, were tied to an iron hook embedded in a wooden beam. The crowd fell silent, that particular silence that precedes violence, where even breath seems an intrusion. Then they hoisted her. For perhaps 10 seconds the method worked as intended. Taiping's feet left the ground. Her body rose, suspended by the weight of 5 decades' devotion to feminine virtue now weaponized. And then something broke. Not Taiping's hair, not her neck. The beam itself. Old wood, weakened by years of use, groaning under a weight it had borne many times but could not bear once more. It splintered with a crack that echoed across the courtyard. Taiping fell, but she did not fall free. The braids held, but her scalp did not. The entire frontal section tore away in a single catastrophic separation, remaining attached to the beam as her body collapsed to the stone below. Blood does not pour from scalp wounds. It sheets, creating a curtain of red that obscured Taiping's face as she lay there, alive, gasping, her skull partially exposed, the white gleam of bone visible through the ruin of skin. The crowd did not cheer. They screamed, a collective sound of horror that contemporary accounts describe as inhuman, as though thousands of throats had produced a single note of revulsion. Here was the thing about this method. Its power depended on distance, on the abstraction of suffering viewed from safe remove. But a princess bleeding in the dirt, her survival rendering the method's brutality undeniable, this was a mirror held too close. The emperor reportedly stood frozen on his platform. Court records suggest he left without issuing any order, simply walking away while servants scrambled to remove the still-living princess from public view. She would survive her wounds, though she would live only another month before dying of infection, hidden away in a forgotten wing of the palace. But something else survived: a crack in the edifice of imperial justice. Within 6 weeks, the emperor issued a decree. The practice of execution through hair suspension brings dishonor to imperial justice and shall henceforth be forbidden in cases involving nobility. Notice what the proclamation did not say. It did not ban the method entirely. Peasant women remained subject to this form of execution. The law protected rank, not humanity. Over the following decades, references to hair execution grew increasingly rare in official Tang records. By 780 ZE, it had vanished entirely from the legal code. But provincial archives tell a different story. Local magistrates continued employing the method for another 2 centuries because it was traditional, because the community expected it. The last documented case in China occurred in rural Guangdong province in the 1740s, nearly 1,000 years after Taiping's failed execution. In 1982, archaeologists found a female skeleton with trauma patterns consistent with scalp avulsion. Carbon dating placed her death in the mid-18th century. She had been buried in a mass grave with 19 other women whose skeletons bore similar trauma. 20 women, 1 grave, no names. The beam broke. Taiping survived for a time. But the method, in all its permutations, never truly died. It simply learned to hide.